Still people will join in. Let me welcome everybody to today's CMR Journal Club. The topic of today is supposed to be on non-contrast enhanced, non-contrast agent enhanced techniques to visualize tissue pathology. We have two fantastic papers today to present. And the first one we'll start with is coming from the working group of Claudia Prieto and René from the King's College in London, and also the School of Engineering of the University in Santiago de Chile. And the first author is Carlos Velasco, and the paper published in MRM is called Simultaneous T1, T2, and T1 row cardiac MR fingerprinting for contrast agent-free myocardial tissue characterization. So Carlos, if I may ask you to share your screen and walk us through the paper. And thank you very much for joining.
Thanks to you for the invitation and for the introduction. Yeah, let me know if you can see the paper. Here?
Yes, we can see it. Great. If you could zoom in just a little bit, some people are on smaller screens, then it's easier than to follow. Thank you. Great.
Something like this work? Yes, perfect. Yeah. So as you said, I'm following the topic of this journal club. This is Simultaneous T1, T2, and T1 row cardiac MRF for, as you said, for contrast agent-free tissue characterization. The reasoning behind this is that we have already done us and other groups very nice papers on T1 and T2 cardiac magnetic resonance fingerprinting, and also extracellular volume and even other work or fat fraction or others. And we wanted to extend this approach, this framework, to show also the T1 row, because T1 row has some promising results in the detection of focal or diffuse fibrosis. It's like an analogous, an endogenous contrast of LGE analogous, but without the need of any injection of any contrast. And there has been many works showing the ability of T1 row to show enhancement endogenously on scar or fibrosis. So we wanted to extend the CMRF approach to have multiparametric T1, T2, and T1 row mapping on the same sequence, and just several breath one breath hold in about 16 seconds. And this way we would be avoiding any problems like misregistering of the maps or patient discomfort or all this stuff that usually happens when we do sequential multiparametric mapping. So the approach would be following the previous work on only T1 and T2 MRF. It would be similar. This would be the sequence. I will go very, very briefly over the sequence. It is a 16 heartbeat sequence performed during just one breath hold, where we enhance or we encode the magnetization in T1, T2, and also T1 row. You can see here the boxes, the color boxes. The red would be the inversion recovery pulses, the green, the T2 preps, T2 magnetization preparation pulses, and we are now adding also, before some of the heartbeats, before some of the readouts, spill-off pulses, which are these blue ones. The details of this new, or not new, but new for the cardiac MRF framework are here on the bottom line. Here we see the preparation of the standard spill-off pulse, and we have played it at 350 Hertz and 40 and 80 milliseconds. The spill-off amplitude will come later to this parameter, but it's important because the highest the spill-off amplitude, the most contrast we can potentially have between a normal healthy tissue and scar tissue. And we played our pulses at the maximum spill-off amplitude available in the scanner, given these 40 and 80 milliseconds of spill-off time, because there were some SAR limitations. So with this sequence, with also fat suppression with these pulses and 30 spirals on each readout window, we were able to see the T1, T2, and T1 row after some reconstruction. The details you will find it here in the supplementary, and after some regularized reconstructions. To compare this sequence, we performed a phantom study and then a healthy volunteer study. In the phantom study, we use a phantom made of different tubes filled with nickel-based contrastation for T1 variation, and also agarose for T2 and T1 row variation. And we perform the usual spin echo long pulses as ground truth, like inversion recorded spin echo, a multi-echo spin echo for T2, and a custom-made T1 row spin echo prepare sequence. And we also perform shorter sequences that would be the clinical references, like MOLI, T2 grace, and T1 row, two profile echo, like a short preparing only one breath hold T1 row. And for the in vivo, we didn't have the time to perform we couldn't afford the long spin echo sequences, so we used 10 healthy subjects, and we validated our sequence against 2D, just one slice at the mid-ventricular level, T1 MOLI and T2 grace, and also a T1 row two profile echo scan, like T1 row magnetism prepare scan, where we would fit the T1 row exponential decay along different speed log times. Here are the details. The results, let me go straight to the T1 row, sorry, to the phantom validation results. Here we can see the correlation plots between our MRF measurements. Remember, these are all MRF T1, T2, and T1 row obtained during the same scan and the same sequence, and against the spin echoes on the top row, on the gray box, and on the short conventional reference scans like T1 MOLI, T2 grace, and T1 row prepared. We can see here that MRF behaves well against the spin echo in T1, and as usually, and as observed many other works, it's a bit overestimating compared to MOLI, or maybe MOLI underestimating compared to MRF. And in T2, we have underestimation, a slight underestimation T2 values for T2, and in both spin echo and T2 grace, and T1 row, we have a slight underestimation also in MRF, but a good correlation against the fast. And let me show you here, I took the liberty to show the support information. This would be the corresponding images of the tubes. Here we can see they are quite homogeneous, and again you can see here of the values, how they are very, yeah, the quality is reasonable. And then if we go to maybe I can zoom out a little bit. The volunteer, healthy volunteer validation, we can see here I'm showing 3 subjects, where on the bottom, on the top row, there are the conventional T1 MOLI, T2 grace, and T1 row prepared one breath hold scans, and on the bottom row, the MRF equivalents. And we have these 3 cases, and in the supplementary, we also show another 3 of the total 10 subjects that we scan. If we go here, and if you let me zoom in, you can see that I draw here on this for this presentation ROI in the septum, so you could see where we were taking measurements for a later statistical analysis to compare numerically the values between the reference and the MRF scans. And this would be the quantification on these ROIs drawn on the septum. You can see that the blind landmark plots, which are on the bottom row, they have a slight bias, positive bias for T1 MRF and negative bias for T2 MRF, and no bias for T1 row. But also you can see that in the range of the measure that we took, there is no trend. The slope of a linear fit that we could perform here would be essentially 0, not significantly different from 0. This means that there is no clear bias on the range of measurements, just a bias due to some limitation of the technique in this case. And finally, if instead of the septum we measure over we divide, following the AHA guidelines, we divide the septum slice in 6 segments, we will have here the mean T1, T2, and T1 row, and also coefficients of variation. You can see, for example, here that apart from the estimation, for example, in T2 or T1 row, the coefficients of variation of the conventional T2 grace and T1 row is higher than the MRF. The MRF has less variability or less variation. This would be the results, and if we go to the discussion very briefly to finish this talk, is that there is some remarks I would like to say. For example, one of the things that we use a totally balanced spin log preparation This is important because there has been in the past other works using other preparations which were robust to either B1 or B0 homogeneities. This one was following the work of Graham et al. This was robust to against B1 and B0 imperfection. And this would be helpful, especially in the case of higher fields. In this case, the scans were done at 1.5 Tesla, but this would be important for higher fields. And in the Phantom study, we have seen that there's a good agreement with those observed in the spin echo and in the patients as well. And apart from the usual, the already known underestimation T1 moly and T2 grays. However, in the T1 row, we saw, you can see here, I can wait a bit more on the right column, we saw which there is a very nice agreement and correlation on image quality on T1 row compared to the conventional scans. I would like to remark that T1 and T2 and T1 raw values in the Phantom, they were similar. They were not we didn't get a difference as we would expect. But this is probably because the type of Phantom that we use, which was agar based, didn't show the properties that we would like to measure with T1 raw. But however, we can here see, for example, that the T1 raw values are higher in a healthy volunteer compared to the T2 values. So in this case, the mechanisms of the T1 relaxation, they do appear and they do show up in the healthy volunteers, but not in the Phantom. So we would like to, in following work, get a better Phantom. And finally, with just the limitation of the study would be that we need to maybe optimize in a better way quantitative, like with Kramer-Rao low-bound rule or any other optimization, optimize the sequence, because this was based on a T1, T2 MRF sequence that was working well, and we just added the T1 raw preparation pulses. And also we totally need to perform scans on patients, not only on healthy volunteers, but patients that has myocardial infarction on any other fibrotic lesions on the myocardium, so we can really see if T1 raw MRF is really working on this type of patients. But apart from these limitations, we have shown that T1, T2, and T1 raw can be performed simultaneously in a single breath-holding MR scans in only 15 seconds with good quality, comparable quality, and comparable also measurements in good agreement with the Phantoms and healthy volunteers. And that will be all of it.
Thank you very much. Before I forward a question from Vengmurti, so just in a brief summary, so you can basically do T1, T2, and T1 row in 16 seconds with good agreement. So the overall time saved, I think, if you do just to do a little math now in my head now. So if you take, let's say, 3 slices, and in 3 slices you get basically 9 different maps that otherwise may have taken, of course, 3 times as much time at least. So that's a significant time saver. And I think with machine learning tools, with new tools, it will be possible probably to use the information from T1 and T2 with T1 row, maybe in combination with Cine, then to extract information that would reflect something that you otherwise would only get with late gadolinium enhancement, like irreversible injury. That makes this a very interesting and important approach. The question I have is, you have a little some systematic variation between the fingerprinting and let's say the ground truth, the maps that has been described before with other fingerprinting techniques, and it has been even speculated that the actual T1 values in the heart may be more likely to be closer to the fingerprinting ones, and that the other techniques may not be as accurate. But the real question, and now come to Venk's question, is do we need then normal values, new normal values, and is the systematic difference large enough that we have to be worried about the clinical application? So do you think it requires more optimization, or is it just that we say, okay, if you do fingerprinting, then you need a set of normal values, which we would anyways need for each scanner, and then go from there? So what do you think should be the next step? And then maybe Claudia and René, feel free to jump in at any time. But Carlos, what do you think?
Yeah, if I may start here, I would say the easiest way would be saying that these are our normal MRF values and don't look at other reference values because they are based on a different technique and other. But before this, then we would really need to make bigger exams, multi-vendor, multi-center, and then have a real reference value for MRF, because we are seeing this bias between, for example, T2, but we really don't have that much statistics compared to the years and years of T1 and T2 mapping. So if we want to be based on these new standard values, we will need to compare more. And yeah, regarding the good scores, yeah.
And then the limits of agreement for specifically for T1 with plus minus 50 milliseconds. Do you think this either will be ironed out somewhere, or will this be enough for clinical practice? I mean, 50 milliseconds is not necessarily huge, but can make a clinical hey or nay.
Yes, I think there has already some results on clinical subjects where we can spot the difference between a healthy subject and a diseased myocardial. And also, especially in case of focal lesions, we have seen different T1 values or T2 values on the region. So if we compare, for example, the remote to the diseased tissue, MRF has enough accuracy or precision to show the difference. In terms of values, if the clinician would be able to say these 55 milliseconds on T2 MRF correspond to healthy or disease, I think we need to do more clinical studies to see if this would correspond to which of the states. But I think that we have already shown in previous papers that MRF can be used for clinical studies because we have seen the difference between healthy and unhealthy.
Okay, thank you. We have time for one more quick question, and this comes from Deborah Kwon. She says, fantastic work. Can you comment if there are any limitations in regards to heart rate to get all accurate measurements for all three tissue properties?
Okay, for example, the one that comes to my mind is the validation for T1 raw for the heart rate, because there is the way we perform it is that we run different speed log times and we let the validation to recover, and there is a clear bias depending on how long we let the validation to recover. We took the compromise to leave, it's on the paper, to leave 4.5 seconds between one readout and the other, so we could fit 5 speed log times in only 20 seconds, which is a result. But we did some additional scans, leaving from 2 seconds to 10 seconds, and there was a negative bias, so an underestimation of T1 raw due to this. The relation between the how long we leave between one speed log and the other and the heart rate is that if the heart rate is if we are skipping heartbeats and the heart rate is shorter, we will if the heart rate is shorter, we'll have this bias. And
okay.
But yeah, sorry.
No, just finish. We're a little bit short in time, so just briefly, and I have one more quick question for René and Claudia.
Yeah, briefly. The MRF sequence, the MRF approach is prepared for these heart rate variations because we are taking into account this relaxation between block and block. So it doesn't matter that much because it's on the workflow.
Okay, thank you so much. And I have to ask that question, René and Claudia, when could people have access to that? What's the plan to get it out to the masses so people can use either this or an optimized version of the sequence?
Thanks, Matthias. So this is actually implemented in Philips. Most of the other cardiac MRF approaches are implemented on Siemens, which I think, just echoing what Carlos said, we do need to do multi-vendors and reproducibility studies. We are already collaborating with some groups, actually with the group that is presenting afterwards. So we are very happy to share it. All that we will notice is that at the moment we have been putting a lot of effort on the acquisition, but not so much on the reconstruction. So the reconstruction is being done offline. But in terms of collaboration, anyone interested on collaborating, we are of course very happy to do it. Just keeping in mind that the reconstruction will need to be done offline. And we will be working on that as a next step.
Yeah, thank you very much. That's really very exciting. So fantastic work. Great. So we have to move on. The next paper is from Deborah Kwon's group at Cleveland Clinic in Cleveland, Ohio. First author is Brendan Eck, and the paper published in the International Journal of Cardiology is called Characterization of Cardiac Amyloidosis using Cardiac MR Fingerprinting. So we stay in the fingerprinting area. So Brendan, take it from here. So please share your I think, Carlos, you have to unshare, and then Brendan can share his screen.
Great. Yes.
Great. Thank you so much. It's really great to share our work with you today. Thanks, Matthias and everyone. So yes, this is our work in using cardiac MRF to characterize cardiac amyloidosis. So going to the introduction, as you likely know, cardiac amyloidosis is characterized by the accumulation of misfolded amyloid proteins in the myocardium, and this leads to impaired function. And myocardial T1 and T2 mapping has been shown through a number of reports and clinically to change in diseased tissue. And so this can be used potentially to expedite diagnosis and treatment. So native non-contrast myocardial T1 is elevated in amyloidosis, and native myocardial T2 has been reported to provide discrimination of cardiac amyloid subtypes. Cardiac MR fingerprinting enables simultaneous measurement of myocardial T1 and T2, as well as other parameters, as you just saw. And this can be done in a single breath-held scan. So this has potential to streamline protocols. And additionally, there may be more information in these cardiac MRF signals. So a recent report shows that MRF residual analysis suggests that signal time courses may be influenced by tissue microstructural variations beyond real axometric parameters. So with this example from this report, there's magnetization transfer, for example, and this is known to be a property that differs between healthy and fibrotic myocardium. And similarly, there are other effects that can also influence MR fingerprinting signals. So diffusion can be one of these, and diffusion tensor cardiac MRI has been reported to characterize amyloid infiltration in the myocardium. So there could be a number of factors within the tissue itself that influences the magnetic signal evolution. So we'll come back to that figure here, but just continuing with introduction. So in this proof of principle study, we wanted to look at the use of cardiac MRF for cardiac amyloidosis characterization. And this is part of an ongoing study. So in this study, we looked at 9 cardiac amyloidosis patients and compared to 5 healthy controls on a 3 Tesla scanner. And we looked at 3 cardiac short axis slices acquired with cardiac MRF to assess native left ventricular myocardial T1 and T2. And this was a 15 heartbeat ECG gated or pulse gated acquisition, breath held with a spiral readout. And so we obtained T1 and T2 maps from inner product matching to a dictionary that contained scan specific signal time courses for unique T1 and T2 combinations. We also recorded the average heart rates during these scans. So we looked at real axometric T1 and T2 values, as well as the measured signal time course data throughout from the acquisitions. The myocardium was manually contoured and divided following the AHA 16 segment model. And then we averaged together the segmental T1 and T2 values to obtain a surrogate measure of global myocardial T1 and T2. And then after doing that, we also wanted to investigate whether there was additional information present in the MRF time courses as compared to the T1 and T2 values alone. So we performed linear discriminant analysis, looking at the mid-ventricular septal segments from both the real axometry and also the signal time course data. Now, to get those MRF signal time courses, what we did is we looked at those myocardial segments, and we obtained a complex valued average time courses throughout those segments. And that averaging helped to reduce noise. And then we used the absolute valued time courses for analysis. And because these time course signal data are high dimensional, we used a regularized linear discriminant analysis. And then after obtaining these LDA analysis data, we looked at the class separability of cardiac amyloidosis as compared to the control groups. We looked at the Fisher coefficient, and then we also looked at a leave two out cross-validation, just to look at the ability to discriminate cardiac amyloidosis and from healthy controls. So as far as results, I think it's easier to look at these visually. We'll go through each part of this figure. So in panel A, these are just example T1 and T2 maps of an amyloid patient as compared to a healthy control. In panel B, it's showing the global T1 values for amyloid showed here on the left and control on the right, as well as global T2. And there were significant differences between the amyloid and control groups, although interestingly, there is overlap between those two groups. Panel C plots the T1 and T2 for each patient and subject with T1 on the y-axis and T2 on the x-axis. And again, you can see that there is some overlap between the patients and controls. Panel D is this concept of looking at the MRF signal time course. So here are shown the signal values, the absolute valued signal for each MRF image frame. So over time, you could see in the red curve here is the amyloid patient signal, and in the blue curve here is the control signal, and you can see that there are some differences between these curves. These black, medium gray, and light gray bars at the bottom just denote the preparation that was applied. So there's an inversion preparation for these black bars here. For the medium gray ones, there was no preparation. And for the light gray, there were T2 preparations. And those details are available on request if you want to know. And in panel E, these are those LDA scores that I mentioned. So showing the time course and the relaxometric data. So you could see that the scores were better separated between amyloid and control for the time course data. They were also separated for the relaxometry data, although that separation was smaller. And in F, this is the Fisher coefficient, which is a metric to assess class separability, showing that there was more class separability for the time course data as compared to the relaxometric data. And in panel G, in that leave two out cross validation, the error rate for the time course based LDA was lower as compared to the relaxometric error rate. And that was statistically significant. So as far as the values themselves, the T1 in the amyloid group was 1,395 versus 1,240 in the healthy controls. For T2, there was about 37 versus 32. As I mentioned before, the relaxometric LDA was increased in the amyloid patients as compared to the controls. However, that was a larger separation in the time course based LDA. So overall, improved separation when looking at the time course data. So moving on to discussion, in this proof of principle report, we did see that there were differences between the cardiac amyloid patients and the healthy controls when looking at both the relaxometric and signal time course analyses. So global measures of myocardial T1 and T2 derived from cardiac MRF were elevated in the amyloid patients as compared to controls. And this suggests the ability for cardiac MRF to detect amyloid deposition in the myocardium. Analysis of the cardiac MRF signal time courses by LDA did show significant differences between the cardiac amyloid patients and controls. And so we did observe greater class separability from that time course data. And we believe that this, or we hypothesize that this improvement in discriminating cardiac amyloid from controls may be due to additional information in those signal time courses beyond that captured by T1 and T2 relaxation times alone. But these differences could be influenced by a number of factors. Although we did notice that the average heart rate did not seem to be, because the average heart rate between the patients and the controls were not statistically significantly different. So we think that's not a likely driver of these observed differences. Two potential sources of the observed differences are magnetization transfer and diffusion, both of which are known to affect MRF signal time courses and have also been reported in the context of identifying myocardial fibrosis and myocardial infiltration of amyloid proteins. However, we definitely need to continue studying cardiac MRF to isolate and identify specific sources of these observed differences. And eventually we could incorporate these mechanisms into the cardiac MRF technique, potentially optimizing the sequence that we use for amyloid assessment or other cardiovascular disease assessments. So these observations from cardiac MRF characterization of amyloidosis highlight the potential utility of MRF, as well as opportunities to further investigate and develop. Some limitations are obviously the small sample size. There were age differences between the amyloid group and control group. And in multiple patients, we use peripheral pulse gating due to inadequate ECG signal or inconsistent triggering. So again, given these limitations, we want to continue evaluating cardiac MRF in a larger patient population. Additionally, evaluation of cardiac MRF-based analysis to discriminate amyloid patients from clinically comparable patients without amyloid disease is needed. So in conclusion, cardiac MRF may enable the characterization of cardiac amyloidosis by simultaneous T1 and T2 mapping, as well as signal time course analysis.
Thank you very much, Brendan. Although we're a little bit short in time, I just wanted to say that although, as you said, the sample size is small and this has to be seen as a kind of a preliminary data set, I found it particularly, so what caught my attention was that you actually added another dimension by the time course analysis. And I think that's a very smart way to extract more of the valuable information that is in all these images or in the case-based data. So I think this is. I hope we will hear more from you about this work, and maybe not only in amyloid disease. So congratulations, and also Debbie, because I know you're on the call here. Just a very small question. I think some of your patients had a pulse trigger. So now, typically, we are very concerned about the pulse trigger when it comes to mapping. So you were not concerned, or what do you think could have been the impact of that?
Yeah, this has come up in our discussions. So we are concerned about pulse triggering and that we may not be capturing the T1 and T2 values at the same phase due to this, because there's always a different delay when you look at the pulse triggering. We would prefer to use ECG triggering. However, one thing in this population is that we've noticed there seems to be a lower voltage coming for the ECG signal. So we may want to look at some either ECG-free techniques that can capture data throughout the cardiac cycle, or some improvements in the ECG triggering itself.
Yeah. No, ECG triggering, I think, is something that we all have to deal with once in a while, and hopefully techniques will improve there as well. So thank you so much, and again, congratulations, Deb and team, for this fantastic work, even though it's still preliminary, but I think it opens a new door for using techniques to extract a lot of information in a relatively short period of time, and then to do tissue characterization without having to use contrast agents. And I think that will be future or one of the important aspects of future CMR. So if you could unshare your screen, Brandon, because I want to just briefly mention the next CMR Journal Club, which will be in a month from now, exactly on May 4th. So that will be one day before the EuroCMR meeting on AI in CMR, and also before the ISMRM. Bettina Bessler will moderate that, and there are two papers related to CMR in patients with pacemakers. One is from Charlotte Manesty and her team on evidence to support MR conditional labeling of all pacemaker and defibrillator leads. So this is, I think, a very let's say a provocative, but I think very important paper, and it will be probably a very interesting discussion. And another one on safety and image quality of cardiovascular MR imaging in patients with retained epicardial pacing wires. So that's work by Konstantin Gattere, published in JCMR.